Hi, I'm Iris, and this is the story of how my late friend's letter helped me reclaim not just a home, but my voice. They said I was forgetting things. Maybe I wasn't thinking clearly, but what they really meant was, you're easier to erase when you stay quiet. Before we go any further, tell me, have you ever been dismissed simply because you were gentle, or aging, or kind? If yes, comment number 1. If no, comment number 0. This is a story about quiet strength, and it just might change how you see the world. It's strange how quiet a house can feel once the person who filled it is gone. Not a peaceful kind of quiet, more like a hush that sinks into the wallpaper, settles into the couch cushions, and waits with you in the long afternoons. Lucinda always told me she wouldn't trust Kenneth with anything more valuable than a broken rake. I remembered that clearly as I stood in the doorway of her study. I hadn't opened this room since her memorial service 3 weeks ago. The sun slanted through the dusty blinds, casting golden stripes across the desk we used to share crossword puzzles on. Her flannel shawl still hung over the back of the armchair. I touched it briefly, then turned to the cluttered desk. I was just trying to tidy things up. That's what I told myself, but my fingers knew what they were looking for before I did. Beneath a stack of seed catalogs and last year's tax return forms, I spotted a thick envelope, cream-colored, sealed with red wax. My name stared up at me in her familiar cursive. Iris. Open only if needed. My fingers trembled as I slid it into the inside pocket of my cardigan, just as Kenneth's footsteps came up the hall. "What are you doing in here?" he barked from the doorway, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. "Thought today was your appointment with Dr. Linwood." "It's tomorrow. I checked twice," I replied quietly, smoothing my skirt. He scoffed. "Well, maybe mark it down this time." Later that evening, we had dinner with Miles. He always managed to drop by when there was something warm on the stove. I made butternut squash soup and biscuits from scratch, Lucinda's recipe. We ate mostly in silence, until Miles looked over his glass of cider and smirked. "Still got that memory of yours, Iris? Or did you forget your own birthday last month too?" Kenneth laughed. "I didn't. I just folded my napkin and excused myself early, retreating to the front porch under the porch light's hum. That night, long after the house had settled into its creaks and sighs, I sat in the reading chair with Lucinda's envelope in my lap. The wax cracked as I opened it. Inside, a handwritten codicil, dated just months before her passing. Lucinda had left everything to me: the house, her savings, even her garden bench. Not a word about Kenneth or Miles. I traced her signature at the bottom, heart pounding. "I can't imagine this," I whispered to myself. "I know what I read." The worst kind of gaslighting is when they do it with a smile. Kenneth smiled too much that morning. Over breakfast, he poured my coffee like it was a favor, not a routine, and slid the calendar toward me. "Your checkup at 10. Just something routine, Iris. You know how it is. At our age, doctors like to stay ahead of things." I knew that tone. Lucinda used to joke Kenneth could charm the legs off a chair, especially if he wanted it sold. I nodded, said nothing, and let him warm up the car while I tied my scarf. Maple Hollow Clinic still smelled of rubbing alcohol and peppermint tea, like it had since forever. The heater clicked loudly in the corner as I signed in. The nurse handed me a paper cup and gestured toward a waiting room with a few scattered chairs and an old stack of Reader's Digest. That's where I spotted Doris Lindell, perched with her knitting bag, eyes bright as ever. "Well, if it isn't Iris Whitmore," she said, standing to hug me. "Lucinda always said you were the only one with your head on straight. Guess she didn't lie." Her words warmed me more than the tea. Dr. Carter called my name. A young man, barely out of school by the looks of it, with a white coat too crisp to trust. His office was modern, neat, cold. Kenneth followed me in without asking. As I sat, Dr. Carter smiled in a way that reminded me of Kenneth's, soft at the edges, but too polite. He asked questions about my memory, my routines, whether I'd misplaced things. I answered clearly. I even remembered the zip code of the post office we used when Lucinda ran the garden club. But every time Kenneth leaned forward and added, "She's been a little forgetful lately," or "She missed an appointment just last week," I saw Carter's pen twitch on the pad. "You seem sharp," Carter said kindly, but his eyes darted once toward Kenneth. I caught the flicker of doubt. As we left, Kenneth stepped outside to take a phone call. I lingered at the front desk to schedule the next visit. That's when I saw it. My name on a folder lying just behind the receptionist's station. The top page read, "Request for Power of Attorney." I stood there for a second, numb. I realize he's not just trying to help. He's trying to erase me, on paper. When we get home, Kenneth locks Lucinda's study for her safety. The doctor said that my memory is bad? I wonder if my health is really that bad? Or is this some kind of plot of my husband behind my back? Is he trying to cheat on me? If you think like me, please leave a comment number 9 in the comment section below. Now, let's get to the next development of this story. Sometimes survival starts with a small cup of cocoa and a familiar face. The wind had picked up by the time I slipped out the back gate. Flurries danced along the sidewalk like they had somewhere to be. I didn't, not really. My feet just carried me where they always used to go on days like this, straight to Norm's diner. Inside, the smell of cinnamon and bacon grease hit me like a childhood memory. Orange lights blinked softly in the windows. Wreaths already hung, despite Thanksgiving still being a week away. I slid into the booth near the back, the one Lucinda used to favor. "Cinnamon cocoa?" Norm asked, his hand already reaching for the chipped mug behind the counter. His voice was the same mix of gruff and kind it had always been. "Yes, please," I said. "And maybe a blueberry scone." He brought them over, his eyes scanning my face a little too carefully. "You doing all right up at the house?" I stared into the swirl of cinnamon on the cocoa. "I might need a little help," I finally said. I left before I could change my mind. Theo Bell's place sat quiet beneath a thin blanket of snow. His oil furnace rumbled somewhere deep inside. When he opened the door, the warmth of crocheted blankets and a sleepy cat named Muffin wrapped around me. The years hadn't changed him much, still soft-spoken, with kind eyes that said more than his mouth ever did. "I remember that blizzard," he said, after I reminded him of the night I'd driven through ice to bring him his medication. "You saved my life, Iris. Don't think I ever forgot." I pulled Lucinda's letter from my coat pocket, then told him everything: Kenneth, the clinic, the locked study. I asked if he'd be my witness if it ever came to that. Someone to say, out loud, that I wasn't losing my mind. Theo listened without interrupting, then stood, crossed to a bookshelf, and pulled down a small leather-bound journal, frayed at the corners. My wife, Nancy, wrote down everything. She used to say the town would fall apart if women didn't keep the stories straight. He handed me the journal. "Might be something in there." Back home, I lit the reading lamp and turned the pages with care. About halfway through, tucked between Christmas lists and pie recipes, was a line dated December 12th, 2009. "If Iris ever needs someone, you help her. She saved your life." Truth has a funny way of hiding in the most ordinary places, like an old leather journal. The wind had picked up that morning, swirling snow across the town square like powdered sugar on a warm bun. Theo and I sat side by side at my kitchen table, the journal between us, pages worn but steady. He ran his finger down the margin of an entry dated sometime in January, his late wife Nancy's handwriting neat, patient. She brought me my heart medicine in a snowstorm. Didn't even wait for Coco, Theo read aloud. Lucinda called her the quiet spine of this whole neighborhood. I smiled faintly. Nancy always did know how to cut through the noise. The next bit of luck came from Doris. She'd been rummaging through her files and emailed me a scanned letter Lucinda had written to the Maple Hollow Women's Association years ago. One line stopped my breath cold. If anything happens to me, Iris knows my heart and should have my home. That afternoon, I took the journal, the printed letter, and the codicil Lucinda left me to Gloria Perry's law office. Her office smelled of eucalyptus and old wood polish, a comforting blend. On her wall hung a quote in looping script, "Truth fears no trial." She adjusted her reading glasses and read through the stack with a quiet hum of interest. Lucinda always had a spine under that pastel sweater collection, she muttered. And you, well, you were never as soft as you looked either, Iris. She trusted me, I said simply. And from what I see here, Gloria replied, tapping the codicil, rightfully so. She picked up the phone and called the notary, whose seal sat at the bottom of Lucinda's letter. After a brief pause, she smiled. Confirmed. He remembers her coming in, said she even brought homemade muffins. By the time I walked out of her office, snow was falling in slow flakes, soft and silent. I held a manila folder close to my chest. Inside it were photocopies, witness notes, and a signed affidavit from Theo. It wasn't just paper, it was proof. It was dignity. I passed the old bookstore on Main Street, my boots crunching over salted sidewalks. Lucinda's favorite shelf still stood in the window, dusty biographies and stories about strong women. When I stepped through my front door, I barely had time to hang my coat. Kenneth slammed the door behind me. You've been busy, haven't you? There's a moment in every storm where the wind suddenly stops, and you realize you're still standing. I sat in the front row of the Maple County Courthouse, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. The wood-paneled room buzzed with a low hum of shuffling papers and whispered speculations. My navy blue coat, the one Lucinda had gifted her years ago, hugged my shoulders like a quiet suit of armor. It smelled faintly of cedar. Kenneth sat stiffly 2 rows away, his jaw set, his tie slightly askew. Miles slouched in the back, trying to disappear into the pew, but still very much a Whitmore by association. The air smelled of lemon oil and old books. Judge Adams entered with a quiet authority, nodding to both counsels before taking his seat. Kenneth's lawyer started strong, painting I as a woman slipping gradually into forgetfulness. She's confused dates, he said, and once locked herself out of her own home. A few in the courtroom glanced toward me, but I kept her gaze fixed on Gloria, who remained calm and composed. Then Gloria stood and, without dramatics, laid out the codicil, Lucinda's own handwriting. She handed over the notarized statement. Doris's letter, a clear declaration of Lucinda's wishes. The journal entry from Theo's late wife. Each piece stacked atop the last, a foundation of quiet truth. Theo took the stand. His voice was low but steady as he told the story of the snowstorm and my help. She didn't ask questions. She didn't hesitate. She saved my life, plain and simple. Then it was my turn. I rose slowly, her boots clicking gently on the floor. I may forget the name of a bird sometimes, I said, her voice catching in my throat. But I remember who I am. I remember kindness, and I remember the woman who trusted me with her home. A hush fell over the room. Judge Adams called a recess. The minutes ticked by with unbearable slowness. I watched the clerk knit quietly in the corner, pale green yarn twisting through practiced fingers. Finally, the judge returned. "The codicil is valid," he declared. "Mrs. Whitmore's mental faculties are sound. Petition for guardianship is denied." Kenneth's face was drained of color. His mouth opened, but no words came out. As he rose to storm out, Miles leaned in just enough to mutter under his breath, "Maybe you should have read the fine print." Lucinda always said every ending deserves a gentle beginning. The snow had softened everything. Even the mailbox, once tilted and squeaky, now stood quietly beneath its white cap. I stepped onto the porch, wrapped in her flannel shawl, the chill brushing my cheeks pink. Christmas lights blinked gently along the eaves, casting a warm glow onto the snow-covered walk. Inside, the house breathed differently now, no longer tense with secrets. The fireplace crackled in Lucinda's old living room, pine cones stacked in a wooden bowl on the mantel. I had decorated simply, pulling out faded ornaments from a storage box marked Ul's Favorites. I hung each one with care, whispering a small memory beneath my breath as she placed it. Norm stopped by with a thermos of spiced cider. "Smells better than my place," he teased, handing it to her with a wink. Later, Doris came by with oatmeal cookies, wrapped in wax paper and tied with string. "Still warm," she grinned. After they left, I sat by the fire and wrote a letter to Theo. I thanked him for believing me, for standing by me when the truth was blurry for everyone else. I enclosed a modest check made out to the Maple Hollow Clinic, with a note. "For the renovation fund, in memory of May Bell, whose kindness echoed louder than any diagnosis." That afternoon, I rummaged through the garden shed and found it. Lucinda's sapling, wrapped in burlap, the roots still healthy. Theo came by without being asked. "You're really doing this?" he said, holding a shovel. "We both know Lucinda wouldn't let weather stop her," I replied with a soft laugh. They planted it near the porch, the earth cold but willing. I patted the soil gently. "Grow it with grace," she whispered. As the sky dimmed and snowflakes returned in slow spirals, I sat on the front steps with a mug of tea. Neighbors passed by with wrapped packages and wool hats, waving as they went. A young girl tugged her mother's coat and pointed. "That's Lucinda's house, right?" I smiled. "It still is, and always will be." Inside, I placed the framed codicil beside the hearth. My fingers lingered on the edge of the glass, and for a moment, the house seemed to exhale. Quiet, steady, home again. "You're home, Lucinda. And so am I." Some homes aren't reclaimed with hammers or lawyers, but with memory, resolve, and quiet grace. I never raised her voice, but every step I took echoed with dignity and quiet courage. Kindness, even when whispered, can outlast the loudest lies. And when we stop judging by appearances, we make room for truths that speak for themselves. So if this story has lingered with you, maybe it's time to look twice at someone you thought you understood and offer them not your judgment, but your listening.